Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Stone Age in Fantasy discussion panel at Virtual FantasyCon. I'm Shane Thomas. I'll let everyone else introduce.
Hey guys, I'm Brhi Stokes. How you doing?
I'm Sarah Buhrman, author of the Runespells series.
And I am Shona Kinsella and author of Ashiel Rising.
Shona, we were texting a bit on Facebook, and you mentioned that your story has a Stone Age culture. You want to talk about that a bit?
Sure. The Ashiel and her people are roughly Stone Age equivalent tribe living on a world called CALIGATION. So they don't have access to any metals. They're hunter-gatherers. That's it.
Awesome. Yeah, I wrote a book called A Paleolithic Fable. I was very inspired by an article I read comparing the Middle Stone Age to Middle Earth, Tolkien's Middle Earth, because there were multiple species of hominins living, coexisting, and even interbreeding with humanity, having a society much like humans, elves, and dwarves and hobbits were all interacting in. So I was really inspired by that, and studied up as much archaeology as I could find, and made a society where each different species had their own kind of individual flavor. Homo erectus ended up living in a tree community, and Neanderthals were kind of the Ice Age hunters up in glaciers, chasing after woolly mammoths and carving canoes out of logs. I thought it was a great idea to take information that we have now that Tolkien didn't have in the 1920s when he was first thinking of The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings. Homo erectus had only just been discovered in the 1920s. So a lot of the scientists of the day still didn't think that it was anything different other than another monkey. They didn't really have a category for hominins at the time. So now that we have research, I thought it'd be great to have a fantasy world based on what was actually here with us.
That sounds really good.
Yeah.
I got a topic question. What do you guys think? Are dragons really dinosaur bones that people just kind of started making up stories about?
I kind of like that idea because you've got a lot of different dinosaurs which are native to different regions, and that would kind of explain different countries and different cultures' view of dragons and how they all look kind of different depending on where you're from.
Yeah, I think it would certainly, it's kind of further back than the Stone Age, but I think that people throughout the years have been finding dinosaur bones and perhaps wondering what these creatures were. And even animals like griffins could have been, part of a triceratops or something, and people are just left to imagine what it would have been like to be around those animals. Let's see, I read something interesting that compared dragons to everything human beings fear in their subconscious mind: snakes, large cats, and birds of prey. So perhaps the myth of dragons would even be in some way tied to it's just everything that could possibly go wrong in an animal for human beings. And finding dinosaur bones might have been a bit of that.
And that makes sense because we do have this fascination with the things that we fear as well. We're drawn towards the things that give us the creeps.
I agree. Yeah, I think one of the reasons that we like to tell stories is it's our way of experiencing, experiencing vicariously through the story what it would be like to encounter some kind of danger, but in the safety of our armchairs or where we like to read.
Well, and interestingly enough, the Asian cultures actually didn't fear dragons. They honored and revered them as a kind of enlightened creature. So the perspective really changes based on which culture you're looking at too.
I mean, that makes sense as well because the Asian dragons tend to look quite different. They don't really look cat-like or bird-like like the Western dragons do as well.
No wings either.
It's true. Asian dragons definitely seem friendlier.
One of the really interesting things about hominins that were in the Stone Age, one of them had really long feet, and the way his feet were designed would have made him kind of lope along, and archaeologists named him the Hobbit, even though his scientific designation is Homo florensis. He was discovered on an island in Indonesia called Flores. These little guys hunted miniature elephants called stegodons that had been trapped on the island, and over generations, since they had scarce food supply, they got smaller and smaller. So I like to imagine these little, long-footed guys running around with spears trying to take down little elephants on the beach. Ended up being a bit of a scene in one of the chapters of the book there. Shona, did you do any digging into early man's psychology or anything like that when you were getting ready to write your book?
Well, I'd read a lot about that stuff before I decided to write the book. So a few years ago, I read the Clan of the Cave Bear books, and I was fascinated. So I followed a lot of her, the bibliography at the end of the book with all the studies and things that she used.
Oh, great, yeah.
So I followed those and read a lot of that research. So when I came to write Ashiel Rising, I'd sort of already had that background research that I'd done ages ago just for fun.
For curiosity, yeah.
So that means it meant that the book sort of flowed quite nicely without me having to go off and dig through big dusty tome.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges and one of the delights of writing in prehistory is there's not that much research you can really do. It's before we knew how to write, so it's a lot left to the imagination. One resource I found, which for any author who is facing world building, especially pre-industrial world building, this is a great reference manual because it's everyone read backwards for a moment, please. Ideas that change the world. It's a reference guide of every idea human beings have had as a culture, starting from the very beginning up to modern things like phones. And when I was preparing for a Paleolithic fable, one of the things I did was just take and flip through all the ideas that were in the prehistory, and strangely enough, one of the first was eating people. So the bad guys in my book are this race of giant, they're Homo heidelbergensis, they're cousins of Neanderthals, and I made them these giant cannibal guys covered in bone armor.
Well, I read that it was quite common for warriors to eat parts of their the people that they were fighting against. So when they defeated them, because they believed it gave them the strength or the wisdom or the knowledge of the people that they had just defeated.
Just imagining the Indiana Jones scene ripping out the heart. Yeah, there was evidence of hominins burying their dead, Neanderthal in specific, would put their dead in the fetal position to bury them. So that's one of the interesting things that I kind of try to work in to wrap around all the fantasy and martial arts. If anyone hasn't read my books, the Anki Legacies Adventures, space travel, these cave people, but mostly it's just about fist fights with aliens. So there's a punch for you there. But if you like martial arts scenes, my books are the way to go. Brhi, I noticed a very lovely book in the background of your room there.
Yep. Yeah, I thought I'd do some product placement while I was in the panel.
So very good. Would you consider urban fantasy or high fantasy? I feel like the protagonist can't get back to Earth, so maybe it's in the realm of high fantasy. But it more had a, what I would imagine, most urban fantasy books type of feel of, in the city, technology similar to what we're used to seeing.
I didn't think too much about genre when I was writing it, and I settled on urban fantasy purely because of the setting and the feel. It's a little bit gritty and dark. I think it lacks that kind of, not lightness, but a bit more of the friendliness that high fantasy tends to have, even the darker stuff. So.
Yeah, that kind of, I don't know, simpler times and optimism type of.
Yeah, exactly.
Things that you feel. Yeah, it's all just labels anyhow, but it was interesting. I was kind of, pondering, I guess. we kind of whipped right through a lot of the prepared topics. Did you guys have any other?
I know you mentioned a bit of magic in the setting. My question was, obviously in prehistoric times, a lot of cool stuff. You've got, your mastodons and saber-toothed tigers and dinosaurs and all that. Do you think it's necessary to have magic, or do you think magic helps expand on the sort of setting and creatures, or do you think you could have one completely mundane, for lack of a better word?
I think that now I've only seen Clan of the Cave Bear the movie, but if I'm not mistaken, there was no magic whatsoever, and that was a very entertaining story. I incorporated magic, but I didn't want to make it so far away from humanity. I wanted to show that we were all equals with our prehistoric cousins. And interestingly enough, this actually brings up the one article I had reread this afternoon, hoping to talk about. This is an article by Chip Walter, and he describes the reason that we're the only hominins still alive. Basically, we're kids for twice as long as any of our other hominin cousins were, like Neanderthal, Homo florensis, or Homo erectus. And it has to do with when the primitive chimpanzees later became Australopithecus and started walking on the savannas in Africa more. The people with narrower hips were able to walk better and then had larger families and bred more successfully. But I'm sorry, narrower hips. But when you had narrower hips, you weren't able to carry a baby. For instance, an ape, if mothers were to develop their babies as developed as apes are when they are born, they would carry a pregnancy for 20 months instead of 10. So I know when my wife was pregnant, we kind of course, did a lot of research, reading, and thinking about that sort of stuff. And one of the concepts we came across was the fourth trimester, which is the first 3 months of your baby's life, when basically they still should be in the womb. They're still developing and don't have too much interaction with the outside world. So there was that shift in hominins, and we became more and more curious. We had more time as young people, not having responsibilities like gathering food and running from cheetahs because your mom will carry you. So it allowed your mind to grow and develop, and that's why we have, as people, become so much more different than, if you meet a chimpanzee in Africa and you meet a chimpanzee in Australia and one in North America in the zoo, they're all going to be pretty much chimpanzees. But when you meet people, we're, all sorts of different kinds of people. So the fact that we had these long childhoods to learn and read books and practice life skills and everything gave us a cut above the other hominins, which eventually led to us either interbreeding with them or them dying out, and us being the only ones here.
Interestingly enough, that same concept is essentially how marsupials work, where they give birth and then continue to develop in the pouch, only we didn't build a pouch. So.
Stuck out in the cold, we had to develop tools instead. The lack of
baby
pouch
carrier
might have been our big salvation. Yeah. To circle back to the topic of magic, I also, in this book, Ideas That Change the World, there were a lot of primitive beliefs. Beliefs in, for one, he had I forgot my own book. One of the beliefs was in basically the forest. Lucas based the forest on this more ancient idea of just the energy of the universe. People have always thought that. So one of the bases, one of the races, how they access that, they kind of have a closer connection to that. And I wanted to, I wanted to give them more access to, they can use that energy to communicate with animals, where other races kind of had to, do like we do and approach them and hope they're friendly. One of the other strengths I had was inspired by have you guys ever heard the stories of a child gets trapped under a pink car and a mom has this burst of adrenaline and is able to pull a car right off, save the baby? Well, my wife has that amazing strength, and she light switches when she jumps out of bed in the middle of the night, and so she's inspired me to the Neanderthals in my story. The the women of the race are the dominant ones, and they have these superpowers under duress. So it's a lot of the magic and kind of fantasy that I used was just slightly out of reach of what we kind of feel we can do already. So I try to make it fantastic, but not, I already had, time traveled and half alien guy in and other magical dragon-like beings, so I didn't want to make it too far out. I felt like I was already there.
I think it's a good thing as well, because then you get to really explore the world rather than exploring the magic.
Right, yeah, and having a complicated magical system and following your own rules and then having to take time to explain what the rules are, yeah. So, lovely to do, and so I really like it when Brandon Sanderson does it, and it's very interesting, but felt like there was enough to kind of focus on rambling through the world. I spent a lot of time looking at the animals that were different from animals we encounter now, and also it was a place in the real world where I had only written a book about some made-up alien planet before, so I had to kind of stick with, okay, would this animal really be there for this scene in the forest? And then when they go on, I just had them cover like thousands of miles. That time has to have progressed, So the book ended up taking place. I tried to follow where a lot of the fossil evidence was, so it from Mongolia down to Indonesia. That bit of a he transports in, and they're up in the glaciers, and the Neanderthal people, or I call them ice hunters, and they have a city built into a glacier. Convenient because there's no fossil evidence for it. So well, it was in the ice mountain. I don't have to prove that. Felt that. That's what happened. So and then they just kind of worked their way through the different life zones, kind of the warmer climate, and finally big confrontation on the beach, which happened to coincide with a geological event that's been studied called the Toba event. About 70,000 years ago, a volcano called Toba erupted and put the world into an ash winter that could have lasted up to 6 years and depopulated a lot of the species that were alive then.
I like the way that you've worked your story in with historical events that can be proven. That gives it that air of something that may have happened. Yeah,
of course I wasn't there, and maybe there could have been aliens fighting right there. We don't know. I like to try to, I approached it like I was writing hard sci-fi, but using archaeology as the science. So there's elements of the fantastic, but it's as accurate as I could have been. What little we know, I did, and I felt like that was great because there was so much that we don't know that I could kind of, I had a lot of room to fill in the blanks, make guesses. So is there any Stone Age fantasy that we know of besides Man in the Cave Bear and what Sean and I have worked on?
I haven't been able to find anything else set in that time period, which means we've got a niche.
All right, high five.
It's not exactly Stone Age, but the culture itself is kind of Stone Age. There's a comic book called Clever Man, which is an Australian Aboriginal superhero who essentially he gets his power from the Dreamtime, which is the Aboriginal beliefs. So I've always thought that playing with that would be really, really fun because that it's not based. It happens to be set in the modern world, but the concepts itself are all very this what we would call primitive culture of the Aboriginals.
You brought up a very good point. There's still Stone Age cultures alive. Oh, there's based on this Clever Man?
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. You brought up a very good point that there's still Stone Age cultures alive now. And Jenny and I, my wife, we watched as many documentaries when I was getting ready to write as I could of Stone Age cultures. And the people that I kind of created around Homo erectus, I called them firebringers because 200,000 years ago, they were the first ones to use fire and start cooking food. I watched this documentary on a rainforest tribe that takes creeper vines and weaves them into bridges. And so I imagine, like, what if they wove their entire city, all their houses, and kind of like this Ewok village of interconnected huts and and marketplace and everything, they had a whole fortress just up in between the trees. So I kind of drew inspiration from him, watching people spearfish now, just like they always have for thousands of years. It was kind of, sure, nothing's written down, but hey, there's guys out there now making it with just rocks and sticks. So it's however they're doing. It's probably how people have always done it.
I did a lot of the same, watching documentaries about tribes that are still living that sort of lifestyle, so that I could get the relationships and the hunting practices and things as accurate as I could.
I watched one documentary on Neanderthal, and they actually were able to make glue using sap, cooking sap at certain temperatures, and the hardening. They would take their quartz spearheads and put it onto a shaft, wrap it in twine, and then put the sap glue on it. And they had the best weapons at the time because of it. I wrote a whole, there was a moment where two characters are bonding and they're kind of laying low in the air. And so I took and actually how to make spears together and make the special glue.
I think there's a
nail
whole
bonding.
Yeah.
There's a whole lot of things that they can do that we wouldn't anticipate. So there's a lot more for us to play with than people might suspect. Yeah,
and it's kind of, I don't know if you took advantage of this too, but I kind of try to think of anything that wouldn't leave fossil evidence. It's like, well, of course they could have done that. We would never know. Another Stone Age person in the modern world movie that was really funny was The Gods Must Be Crazy, Part 1 and 2.
Oh my God, that is so old school.
Yeah. You when you started talking about Clever Man, I was like, oh, I remember. I got the perfect example. Okay. Hey, this has been really fun. Do you guys have anything else you want to go over? Or I feel like I was really pumped. It's hard to talk to people about cavemen when you
I've done some research in the past on the kind of parallel sciences of how different sciences work together to create certain cultural differences. And the one example that sticks out is geology and anthropology go side by side, because the way that you can travel either latitudinally or longitudinally changes whether or not you can take something from one portion of your space to another portion with the climate not changing significantly. So things that are latitudinal, lands that are latitudinal, you have a lot more flexibility in movement than lands that are longitudinal, like Africa. And so you're far more likely to develop more stable environments with that, because you learn what's edible over here, and then you go over here and you go, oh, it's the same thing. Whereas in longitudinal ones, you're like, learn what's up here, and then you go down here and you're like, eh. And the other aspect of it was the domestication of animals, because you can take animals from place to place and find the same foods and climate and things like that, where in a longitudinal area, it's harder to do that. So, it's really interesting to see how different sciences work together to create these developments in different areas, simply from something as weird, who would ever think that whether or not your continent goes up and down or side to side is a big deal, but it is.
Yeah, but I mean, if it makes sense, if you're trucking a bushel of bananas and you go up into the mountains where it freezes, they're all going to go bad. So instead you turn to the right. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I never really gave that thought. And when I did write the book, it was kind of as the latitude changed, the people changed with it. I figured that, obviously they're going to be wearing lots of furs up if they're living in the side of a glacier, and then, they're going to be more able to eat a plant-based diet and live off the land in the forest and in the jungle than they would on a frozen wasteland or even on a desert island. So there was that kind of consideration, but I never thought about, as far as, I guess, as a species, they probably would have spread similar way, just taking what they already knew how to do. Especially, given the fact that they had less childhood for development. Once you kind of learned your skill set, you're probably the type of person that said, this is what I can do, and I'm going to try and do it wherever it's the most advantageous, rather than being like, well, hey, let's learn to walk through snow and invent snowshoes or whatever and try to get around.
Well, if you think about it, the species that we are today is actually incredibly flexible on where we can live, what kind of environment we can live in, compared to other plant and animal species. We are insanely flexible in that, because we make things.
That's why in my book the humans didn't get superpowers. We're crafty. That's our power. Was kind of the great equalizer there. It's and the human character that's the antagonist. She always seems to kind of have that thought that gets them out of a jam, even though one's really strong and one can kind of dream walk to other places and spy on people, and they can all do these different things. But she's just got the bright idea and kind of gets them past the whatever hurdle.
I just had this image in my head of a Justice League member called the Scrapbooker.
I think that's it for all of us, huh? Well, everyone at home, I appreciate you tuning in. Hopefully you learned a bit about the land before writing. Stay tuned. We'll bring you some stories delving into prehistory, and have fun at Virtual FantasyCon this week. There's other panels, and get around everyone's author page and have a blast. Thanks.